remarks to get us started, and then we'll pass it over to our speakers for today. So just wanted to give a quick update on the guidebook, the National Ecosystem Services Partnership online guidebook. We've provided a couple updates. We've incorporated some great papers that have come out. The CFAIR has produced a number of papers in partnership with USDA on forest carbon pollination and water quality, looking at how they're affected by different USDA programs. And in addition, the U.S. Forest Service had a couple different papers on how they're integrating ecosystem services into their policy and practice. In addition, I wanted to note this new Bridge Collaborative Partnership, which is looking at a broader view of ecosystem services, thinking about linking across health, environment, and economic development sectors to solve global problems. There's a link to that on the Nature Conservancy website with more information if you're interested in finding out more. You can also put a note in the chat box to me if you'd like to find out more. And I just wanted to note there are a couple papers we've recently put out on environmental or ecosystem services markets, one on wetland and stream mitigation, and another on how large-scale planning is integrated into environmental markets. Either of those are interested, they can also be found on the Nicholas Institute website, and I'm happy to provide more information. We wanted to note our next webinar. We have a webinar on the new Ecosystem Services Toolkit from Canada, which is a great tool that's been developed for that government, but I think would be useful for anyone trying to do this kind of work. They'll be presenting on that tool on May 25th. And we're open for other ideas if people have other ideas for webinars, so please let us know. And our past webinars are recorded and available on our website. So now I'm just going to briefly introduce the presenters today. We have Doug MacNair. He's a technical director at Environmental Resources Management and is based in Raleigh, North Carolina. He's also a part-time seconded to the Natural Capital Coalition as a technical manager. The second speaker is Zabey. Eva is a director of the Natural Capital Ecosystem Services at the World Business Council for Sustainable Development. She leads their work on natural capital measurement and valuation in business, as well as ecosystem management. So I'm going to turn the presentation over to our speakers, and they're going to be presenting about the work of the Natural Capital Coalition today. So we're going to switch over to your slide deck and get you set up to speak.
Okay.
Presenters now? Yeah.
So
okay. You should be presenter now.
Okay. So do I need to share, or am I?
You do need to share, yeah.
Okay. All right. And there we go. Has it shown up?
Yep, it's showing up.
Okay, great. Well, good morning, everybody, and thank you for joining us this morning to talk about the work of the Natural Capital Coalition and the World Business Council's Protocol Toolkit. I also want to thank NESP for having us on to do this webinar. Both Eva and I are actively involved in trying to increase the uptake of both the protocol and the toolkit, and this is just a great opportunity to get out the word about these two opportunities to involve ecosystem services and natural capital in decision making. So we appreciate this opportunity. So the way we're going to do this is I'm going to provide a brief overview of the coalition. Eva will do the same thing about the World Business Council, and then we'll do more detailed descriptions of both the protocol and the new toolkit. All right. So first, on the coalition itself, the coalition is a very large-scale collaborative group. We have over 250 members right now, and they come from all sectors of the space that's interested in natural capital and ecosystem services. We've got research and academic groups, NGOs, business, policy groups, and finance and accounting. And we've tried very hard to make this a very broad coalition in order to help make sure that the methods that the protocol uses are acceptable and understood by a wide variety of groups that are interested in natural capital management. So the purpose and approach of the group is pretty broad, and it's very practical. The group is trying to mainstream the use of including natural capital considerations in decision-making by private businesses, with the ultimate goal of being able to enhance and protect natural capital. As many of you know, natural capital and environmental issues often don't get included to the same degree in internal decision-making that it should. So the goal of this group is to be very practical and focused on explicit things that we can do to make sure that natural capital is considered and that companies recognize value by doing so. All right, we're engaged in a wide variety of activities in order to make that happen. And so here's a little bit more detail on those activities. I'm not going to go into these in any great detail, but what I do want to just mention briefly is on this harmonization, where it's recognized that there are a lot of different frameworks and approaches and tools to be able to measure and value natural capital. And what we're really focusing on is not necessarily inventing new ones, but harmonizing all of those approaches so that companies and coalition members can have a broad enough framework that encompasses many different dimensions of natural capital, and that there's agreement that this type of approach, this framework, should be used going forward. And we don't want to just drop the framework and the protocol out there. We want to make sure there are resources that are available to companies to use it. And so that's sort of the enabling environment and the outreach and advocacy to make sure that this is uptake, to increase the uptake of this going forward. All right, and just as a brief introduction, we have a protocol, which is a broad framework for measuring and valuing natural capital and internal company decision-making. But along with that, we've got several sector guides and supplements that are designed to help companies apply that broad protocol to the issues that are affecting their specific industry or the specific resources that they are most concerned about. So we've done food and beverage and apparel. That came out last year with the launch of the protocol. We're working on ones now for the built environment and forests. And we've got out for consultation now a guide for the financial services industry, and we'll soon be starting one on the oceans with a collaborative effort, again, between NOAA will be involved in that effort, many groups in the UK, as well as businesses. All right. And we'll return to these topics and talk about them in more detail later on. But now I'm going to go ahead and turn to Eva and the World Business Council.
Thanks very much, Doug, and I hope you can hear me, everyone. In any case, it's a real pleasure. Thank you for the opportunity. And as Doug was saying, the Coalition and the World Business Council have been working very closely on the protocol, but also the toolkit that I'll talk about a bit later. But basically, to let you know what the World Business Council for Sustainable Development, or WBCSD, is an association of about 200 leading companies. And our vision really is to create a world in which more than 9 billion people live well within the limits of our planet by 2050. So on the next slide, you can see who our member companies are. We represent over 20 different industrial sectors, and collectively we feel that we can really have a very positive impact. We work on so many different sustainability areas, from cities to circular economy, social capital measurement, rural livelihoods, water issues, food, and much more. And on the next slide is just one more slide on our natural capital and ecosystems cluster, which is where the natural capital measurement and valuation piece comes in. And essentially this year we are really dedicated to helping our member companies use the natural capital protocol and toolkit to really get them to measure, value, and manage natural capital more consistently. And then also a major focus this year on trying to simplify language. So I mean, I've been at WBCSD for many years, and WBCSD itself has been working on environmental and ecosystems and biodiversity issues for over 20 years, and still it remains a pretty niche topic that gets lower down the agenda than it deserves. So I think a lot of that relates to communications, and we have some exciting work ahead of us. So really the purpose is to scale up, and I'll hand back to Doug now that I've given you an overview of WBCSD and our work on natural capital in a nutshell.
Okay, so the next set of slides is going to tell you more about the way in which the protocol was developed and what it's trying to achieve, and talk about some of the major facets and steps in the protocol, and then also provide some case studies that have been completed using the protocol. Just first, a quick word on what is natural capital. For the purposes of this group, I think the easiest way to describe it is the stock of natural assets from which ecosystem services flow. So you've got the services are the flow, and natural capital is the stock that provides those services over time. So they are closely linked. The protocol itself is a standardized framework for helping businesses measure and value the direct and indirect impacts and dependencies on natural capital. And I think the key aspect of this is that it focuses on not just impacts, which is the extent to which there might be harm done by a company in terms of emissions or air emissions, water emissions, water use, but also dependencies. And I think that's where companies are finding the most value in the protocol, is recognizing that they are dependent on natural capital, and that by better managing that and measuring and valuing natural capital, they're going to be able to improve their business performance. So the protocol, and I'll just put all of these up at once, it builds on existing materials that are out there. If you do any kind of Google search on natural capital, you'll find many different sites out there. And so the goal here was not to just create another site, but to bring all of those different frameworks and sites together in a standard way, so that companies in particular could have a single resource for being able to improve their decision making. another key aspect of this is that it is for internal decision-making, and it does provide just guidance. So it is not a standard. It doesn't provide any standards as to thou shalt measure natural capital using this technique. It just provides guidance on best practices and ways in which companies can measure and value those impacts. The development of the protocol was a fairly unique collaborative process. There were two teams involved, one led by Eva and the World Business Council, focused on the actual development of the protocol itself, and ERM and myself were involved in that effort. And then there was another group led by IUCN that actually developed the sector guides and undertook the piloting of the protocol and the sector guides, and making sure through a series of interactions and workshops with businesses that this was actually meeting their needs to improve decision making. So the focus is on decision making, so that means it does focus on issues that are of practical importance to companies, and it's designed to be able to be applied in a wide range of different settings throughout the company. Ways in which natural capital can affect both their operations, like their water footprint or their emissions footprint, legal and regulatory issues that they might be involved with, and also their reputational and marketing issues as well. So it applies to a broad range of risks and opportunities, and many of the companies are finding that one of the main values of the protocol is being able to think through all of the potential impacts and dependencies that natural capital can have on the company itself, and that by doing so, they're able to gain a competitive advantage because there's an asset or a resource or an input into their business process that they hadn't accounted for and others aren't accounting for, and by doing so, they gain an advantage. So here's where the coalition and the protocol itself fit within the space of all of the different efforts that are out there. Things like the Carbon Disclosure Project or SASB, the Greenhouse Gas Protocol, etc., which, at the very outer reaches of this are focused on external disclosure and strategy, whereas the protocol itself is before those stages or occupies a smaller space, since we're focusing on decision-making and internal decision-making for companies. All of these steps are going to be necessary to enhance and preserve natural capital, ultimately, but the protocol's place is earlier in that process. Now, the next slides give an overview of the protocol framework itself, and you'll see that there are 4 major stages to the framework, and then within that there are a number of steps. So the steps cover why should you do this in the first place, what should be done, how you should do it, and then what do you do next. I guess a couple of words about the framework itself. Many large companies already have a decision-making framework that sort of parallels this in the sense of sort of scoping out what needs to be done then measuring and valuing the specific business application or business problem, and then coming up with a solution to that problem, and then deciding what next steps to take. We have found that for many of the large companies, the protocol really can be embedded within their own current decision-making framework, and is more of an addition to that process. For smaller companies that don't have the resources or the structured framework for this kind of decision-making, then all of the steps of the protocol can help provide value to them. In terms of the measuring and valuing stage, the measurement can apply both to specific important elements for the company itself and providing value to the company itself, but it can also consider more broadly the value of natural capital to society. And it allows for and describes different techniques for measuring and valuing natural capital both in qualitative, quantitative, and monetary terms, both in terms of the business and the value to society. So it doesn't prescribe a particular approach. It simply lays out that when a company is undertaking an assessment, what are the approaches that are available and how they might be used to evaluate and conduct a natural capital assessment. And if you go to our website, you'll see within the protocol there's a hypothetical example that of a company as it goes through all of the steps of the protocol, and there are also some templates available for answering many of the questions that are shown in the framework that companies can then use to apply the protocol. So I do want to spend just a couple of minutes talking a little bit about the key definitions and key idea behind the protocol itself, and these refer to both the impacts and the dependencies that companies find themselves on. And one area that we're really trying to work on is sort of standardizing, if nothing else, the language that's used to describe all of these things, because there are a lot of different ways of describing the same concepts, and one almost needs a Rosetta Stone to go from the different frameworks. So here we're trying to come up with some standardized language that we hope will become generalized and used to describe some of these key features. So one is the impact pathway, and this is and we'll go through a little example here. So the impact driver for this might be emissions from a chemical manufacturing facility. So that is the business activity that is going to result, that is going to be the focus of the assessment for looking at impacts. All right, so and that's covered by step 5 of the protocol. And those impact drivers lead to changes in natural capital, in this case reduced air quality, and those impacts on natural capital are measured in the step 6 of the protocol for measuring changes in the natural capital. And then there are changes in natural capital, and that is covered by step 7, which is the area where the impacts are valued. And here, in this example, it's about the health impacts of those emission releases. Again, it's not necessary that those impacts have to be valued in monetary terms, although that would often make sense. But it could also be represented in terms of the number of cases of certain types of health problems, or it could be the cost of resolving those those healthcare problems. So in a dependency, that is where some natural capital is contributes to the long-run profitability of the company and might be affected by changes in the stock of natural capital. So here you have a coffee producer who obviously depends on coffee beans from its growers, and one of the assets that they have is pollination from bees. And as bee populations change as a result of climate change and the use of pesticides, that's going to have an impact on the amount of coffee that's produced. So in step 5, you would measure those dependencies. Step 6, again, you look at the changes in the natural capital as a result of the reduction in bee pollination. And then in step 7, you could value those dependencies. So what are the alternatives, if there are alternatives to bee pollination, or what is the loss in revenue as a result of reduced productivity or higher prices for coffee inputs? All right, so real quickly, here are some case studies. And again, the goal here is just to give you a flavor for how the protocol is being applied. In this particular case, the company was concerned about minimizing the impacts on the environment through collaboration to design assets using green technologies for improving their resource efficiency, and where possible, using renewable energy, and either through their on-site management or through responsible procurement. So in other words, taking a close look at their supply chain so that they could better understand how they could both reduce their own costs and also help nature. And as a result of this process, they found that they could save up to 50,000 pounds per year, British pounds, in terms of reducing their own costs. Hugo Boss, they applied this in the apparel sector using the apparel guide, and what they were focusing on was converting what had been life cycle assessments into basically monetized life cycle assessments, so that they could identify some environmental hotspots within their supply chain so that they could better reduce those impacts. And here their focus wound up being on the supply of cotton and cotton cultivation techniques, in particular water use in the countries and areas that were growing the cotton for their products. In the forestry sector, this is an example of the protocol being applied being used in a way that's not directly for a company, but for an agency. And the goal here was to capture and measure the value that's being provided by forests throughout England. And they estimated what those values were that are not captured in traditional financial accounts. So this provides an estimate of the value of their land holdings that doesn't show up otherwise. And then finally, an example for measuring or comparing alternatives for upgrading water treatment works, focusing not only on the cost of the system itself, but also the natural capital impacts. And there you can see within the options that they considered. They also evaluated the potential values for climate regulation, air quality, and recreational services as well, and came up with a total value to society that was part of or influenced the selection process for the way to upgrade the water treatment plant. All right, so those are the examples, and now I'm going to turn this over to Eva, or do I? I'm sorry, Sarah. Do I turn it over, or do you do that, or I stop sharing?
Hi, I think hopefully you can see my screen and hear me now.
Okay.
Great. Thanks, Doug. And so to continue on the protocol and the next step of being this toolkit, it's now my pleasure to share a bit of an overview of the Natural Capital Toolkit. So just a little bit of background on where this idea came from is that the Natural Capital Protocol, as Doug took us through, is really a comparable process for companies to go through to measure and value their impacts and dependencies on natural capital. But it does allow, on purpose, for flexibility in its application. So it can be used for any sector, any geography, and any kind of scope of assessment that you need, whether you're looking at a product or a company. So it does not actually prescribe specific tools or methodologies or approaches. We do talk about the kind of fundamental approaches like LCA and input-output models, etc., but we don't talk about the specific methodologies or tools. And therefore, it does not allow for comparable results as companies use this. And so the toolkit is a first step towards more comparability in that it interactively consolidates and maps relevant tools against the protocol framework. And where this could go is that once we have this one-stop database of relevant information, we can then, over the years, start to grow elements of peer review and testimony to know which of the tools are actually most beneficial and valuable and used by business, and therefore we can start to move towards more generally accepted recommendations. So, for example, if we can see when we look at the analytics of the toolkit over a few years that 80% of business users seem to use this particular tool to value water for this context, then perhaps we can say, well, shouldn't it become the standardized way to do that? And with all the coefficients and assumptions and values that are part of that tool, we'll then be able to have comparability of results. And we will need to move towards more prescriptive tools in order to have this comparable results. And at WBCSD, the overall message is we would like companies to compete on performance, not on methodology. And that's ultimately what's been happening in this space and why there's been so much duplication, is that companies have ended up having to, in a way, compete on methodology instead of performance because there's not that comparability. And many efforts to map which tools are out there have already been undertaken. To note a few on the screen here, WBCSD has done this, BSR does an annual review of the tools out there, the Coalition has done it, but others have as well, the EU Business and Biodiversity Platform. And basically the real issue with these are that they're kind of they're snapshots and they're not kept up to date or interactive. And so the toolkit is really this interactive database of tools, and we use tools in quite a loose way. The term tools, it can mean a resource, a methodology or approach that is relevant to natural capital measurement and valuation. There's more detail on each tool of what kind of a tool is it in the fact sheets, and I'll come to that in a bit. And the objective really is to complement and facilitate business uptake of the protocol and the sector guides. It is quite overwhelming for companies to enter this space. Do they know whether the tools they've really been using in a way fit into the protocol framework, and the toolkit can help out for that? Or alternatively, if a company doesn't know where to start, then maybe the toolkit can help them identify which actual more specific tools can help them with the with a specific measurement and valuation. In terms of the scope of the toolkit, we've been pretty strict about we have been strict. We've applied 3 criteria in order for a tool to be included. One is it needs to be relevant to the protocol, which does mean that it needs to be useful for a natural capital assessment. It needs to be applicable to business, even if business was not the initial intended audience, and it needs to be available to the public, even if there's an associated fee to access the tool. And this last one is very important because essentially it means we're not including proprietary tools that can only be accessed or used with a consultant. So even if you need to pay for a tool, that's fair enough, but then the business user needs to be able to understand the tool itself and use the tool and get the results themselves. In terms of the timeline that we're on, we've been engaging an advisory group, and I'll come to that, a multi-stakeholder group to help build this toolkit. The Natural Capital Coalition has been our strategic partner in this, and WebDigi, the logo on the top there, is our web developer. So on the 27th of March, a few weeks ago, we launched, we released the toolkit for pilot testing. There's an online feedback form to use, and so basically you have until the end of tomorrow to have a look at the toolkit and provide your feedback if you can. That would be amazing. And we're collecting all this feedback, and then we'll be updating the toolkit based on that feedback. And the launch will be on the 13th of July, which will be exactly day for day 1 year after the launch of the Natural Capital Protocol. So we're really keeping this space moving along. What I did want to do now is just to take you through the toolkit very briefly online, and you can have a look on your screens afterwards as well. So the website is naturalcapitaltoolkit.org, and you'll see that this is where you can give your feedback. It links to a survey. You can start filtering just by putting in any kind of word or sector, and it will already filter which tools you can access there. You can filter by step of the protocol, so these are the protocol steps, and for the pilot version available now, it's only active for steps 5, 6, and 7 on measure and value, which were the ones that needed the most attention straight away, is what we think anyway. So you can see which ones may help you value, and then you can start to also filter depending on impact drivers, and these are all from the protocol language as well. So which ones may help you for this, geographic codes and other aspects. What I will just show you here is who. So I did mention the advisory group. This is a very informal group, and if those on the line would like to get involved, please do let us know. We're going to be engaging the advisory group through the next few months as we make decisions on what changes to make for the final version. And then, of course, here is where you can submit a tool. You can submit a tool anytime, and the one thing that is kind of important to know when you submit a tool, as long as it meets these criteria, there's a form to fill in, and then there's also, you need to provide a contact name for a third-party verifier, who then we will write to make sure that the information that you have provided is correct. So that's a kind of verification mechanism, which is light touch, but is at least something. And we know from hearing from tool developers that have submitted a tool that actually the fact that you know that someone else is going to check the information, you don't let yourself oversell your tool too much. So just to end with on the toolkit, I'm going to just open up, for example, this first tool, and each of them has a fact sheet here which provides more information about it, other kinds of impacts and dependencies that are covered, but also what kind of valuation, is it qualitative, quantitative, monetary. We also provide which organizational focus and value chain boundaries that refer to, and then what kind of a tool. So this is what I was saying before about, is it more of is it a set of equations? Is it a list of measurements or values? Is it more spatial mapping? Is it an online calculator? And it's always important to, have that information. So some skills, and any other uses of the tool. So with that then, and part of the discussions that we'll be having with the advisory group is, hey, are there some of these other filters that should be brought up front onto this main page because they're actually going to be more important for users. So I'll now go back to my slides, and I think, Doug, you just had one or two more slides to end with. So
yes.
Over to you again.
Thank you. You've got one last slide here on resources that are available. On the Coalition website, we have the Natural Capital Hub, and it contains a lot of links to different case studies or background information, news stories, etc. So it's meant as a resource to help companies and others find out more information about what's going on in the natural capital space. And we're working very hard to keep that the Natural Capital Hub up to date, especially with case studies. So this is a good complementary resource, I think, to the toolkit in that it provides broad background information about the natural capital space. And then finally, just the last slide. Should be one more, I think. So just so folks on the phone know that there are many opportunities to participate and collaborate in this space. And so the coalition and the members of the coalition are always looking for additional resources and people to be involved in different activities that we're undertaking. And so that can go from anywhere from leading a project, such as the development of a sector guide or a supplement, or out to, applying and applying the protocol to a specific problem and then sharing the results of that through, let's say, the Natural Capital Hub, or just joining the coalition, and there's no price involved, and staying informed on the different activities of the coalition and what's going on in the natural capital space. And that is the last slide.
Thanks so much for the presentation today. It was great to hear all the details and different aspects of the work that's ongoing. There's a lot of really great resources under development. Are there any questions in the chat box yet? No questions. So participants, if you have questions, put them in the chat box and we can share those with the presenters and have answers to them. I just thought I'd start with a general question about kind of where do you see this going in the next few years? Are there additional pieces you're trying to build out in the next few years, and then kind of longer term, what your hopes are for the coalition and its work?
Well, I think that's a great question, and I think the sort of shorter range goals are really to increase the uptake of the protocol by businesses and make sure that the companies have the resources in terms of information and data and tools to be able to apply the protocol and or the sector guides to meet their specific needs. And that's going to continue longer term to sort of expand the use of the protocol, and then starting to look at ways in which we may be able to provide, or not the coalition directly, but make sure that there is ultimately data that is available to support these different types of natural capital assessments.
Yes, so if I can add to that, I think
Sure.
WBCSD's ambition is very much aligned with that of the coalitions in terms of encouraging uptake of the protocol, but basically around measuring and valuing and then managing natural capital. And the longer term picture is we really need to ensure we have references that are seen as generally accepted, like the protocol, so that also companies feel some comfort in that what they're trying to do does align with what other companies are doing. And then over time start to coalesce around more prescriptive approaches. Really, as I was saying about the toolkit, on this journey from being a comparable process towards more comparable results, and then it can feed into external disclosure and reporting, and investors can start to use that information in a more meaningful way, rather than the kind of slightly very noisy space that it is right now.
Thanks, that's very helpful. So I'm going to pass it over to Sarah, who has a question as well.
Yeah, I was just going to ask, what are some of the sort of major motivations of these companies who are sort of taking up the protocol and starting to use it? Is it primarily to protect natural capital, or is it kind of social image, or what sort of ideas have you been gathering in this first year that it's been out?
Well, I'll go first, Eva, then if you want to add to it. I guess the best example is Dow, in the sense that they participated in looking at natural capital impacts originally because they just wanted to get their arms around the magnitude of the challenge. And then once they became more familiar with it, they were able to understand that it can create significant business value for them. And so their latest sustainability goals require, or they have a goal of capturing $1 billion in value as a result of explicitly including nature in their decision making. So I think there's a lot of first mover or thought leadership involved in companies that have been early adopters of the protocol because they understand that it provides business value and at the same time can also preserve society's interest in natural capital.
Thanks, Doug. So to build on that also, I think overall companies are still entering into this space of natural capital measurement and valuation. And so, of course, there are leaders that want to go fast and that want to start to understand their risks and opportunities related to natural capital impacts and dependencies. But right now, in terms of the uptake, there'll be a whole range of companies that have already carried out some form of natural capital measurement, whether it's on GHG emissions or water or land or waste, but they may not necessarily know that it is what others consider being part of natural capital impacts and dependencies. And so they'll do a kind of retrofit pilot test of basically seeing if their approach can map alongside the protocol framework. So I think we have relatively limited, completely new cases of companies that have entered into this space using the protocol, and that hopefully we can build over time. But I think the primary entry point will be to manage risks, and also the communication side of, I'm just thinking of Puma and then the broader group Kering, of basically realizing that if they communicate to their senior management and their board using monetary valuations to identify as a decision-making tool where in their supply chain are the biggest impacts and therefore the biggest risks, it's a much stronger tool for communication to senior management than just saying a qualitative assessment saying this is a major issue. And in fact, in the Puma case, it really raised the importance of, in fact, leather being one of the most important impacts that Puma has. And you would imagine that the company would have already known that, but it was and the environmental guys in the company did know that, but it was the communication and kind of raising the flag to the board where the additional value of, carrying out the valuation exercise really came into play.
Thank you. So we don't see any questions from the rest of the community that's online. So maybe if you have any closing comments or last thoughts you'd like to provide to the group, and then we'll thank you for the presentation.
Thanks. Well, from my side, I'd just like to thank all of you, of course, but also encourage everyone to have a play around with the toolkit. And please, if you do have any feedback, please complete the online survey or write me an email, but ideally you could fill in the survey because that will be it. Then we'll start to make improvements. And if you have tools that you think should be added, then really please do quickly get in touch with tool developers to ask them to submit their tools. Thanks very much.
I guess, too, I just want to encourage everyone on the phone to be actively involved in the activities and collaborate with the Coalition and the World Business Council on the protocol and the toolkit. We have seen a lot of interest in the toolkit and the protocol in Europe. In the United States, not as much. And so we want to engage with as many groups as possible to increase knowledge, awareness, and use of the protocol and the toolkit going forward.
Well, great. Thanks so much. Thanks for presenting on this work today, and we will have a recorded version of the webinar on our website, so feel free to share that with others as well to spread the word. Thanks so much.
All right. Thank you.